There's a fortress on Chicago's south side that most people drive past without a second glance, a massive stone pile that looks more like a medieval castle than a home, with turrets and battlements and walls thick enough to stop an army, and if you stand outside those walls today, what remains of them, because most of the original structure is long gone. You might wonder what kind of fear or paranoia or guilt drives a man to build his house like a fortress, what enemies he imagines storming his gates, and what dark truths about American capitalism and the meat that built Chicago hide behind those defensive walls, because this is the story of Philip Danforth Armour and the mansion he built with a fortune extracted from the bodies of animals and the labor of men who worked in conditions so brutal they would inspire Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, a fortune so vast that Armour became one of the richest men in America, and yet he chose to live in a house that announced not confidence but fear, not celebration but defensiveness, not pride but the knowledge that the money was blood-soaked and that the workers whose labor he exploited and the animals whose deaths he profited from and the consumers he sometimes deceived with adulterated products might someday demand an accounting, and the mansion he built, sometimes called Armour Castle or the Armour Mansion, located in what was then the wealthy Prairie Avenue district where Chicago's industrial barons clustered together for mutual protection and social reinforcement, was a physical manifestation of the moral complexities and the class warfare and the sheer brutality that characterized the meatpacking industry in late 19th century Chicago, an industry that quite literally butchered animals and exploited workers on an industrial scale never before seen in human history, that transformed both meat and labor into commodities processed with mechanical efficiency, that created unprecedented wealth for a few men while creating unprecedented suffering for workers and animals, and that established patterns of industrial capitalism, vertical integration, cost-cutting through exploitation, manipulation of markets, political corruption, that would define American business for generations, and if we're going to understand Philip Armour and his fortress mansion, we need to understand the industry that created him. The Chicago stockyards where millions of animals were killed and processed annually, where thousands of workers labored in conditions that were cold in winter and sweltering in summer, where the air was thick with blood and smoke and the smell of death, where workers lost fingers and hands to machinery, where the speed of the disassembly lines meant that one moment of inattention could be fatal, where chemical burns and infections were routine, where workers were paid by the piece so that injuries meant not just pain but lost income, where employment was precarious and unions were crushed with violence, where the machinery ran constantly and workers were expected to keep pace regardless of human limits, and where the profits extracted from this system of mechanized slaughter and human exploitation made men like Philip Armour richer than most people could imagine while the workers who actually did the killing and cutting and packing lived in poverty, in overcrowded tenements near the yards where the smell of death was inescapable, where disease spread quickly through dense populations, with inadequate sanitation, where children often had to work alongside parents because family survival required multiple incomes, and where the American dream of upward mobility through hard work was revealed as largely mythology because no amount of hard work in the killing floors could earn you what the Armours accumulated by owning the system itself, and this disparity, this fundamental injustice at the heart of industrial capitalism, was not an accident or an unfortunate side effect but was the very mechanism through which wealth was accumulated, because Armour's millions came directly from the difference between what workers produced and what they were paid, from the exploitation of their labor power, from treating them as cheaply replaceable inputs rather than as human beings with inherent dignity and rights, and from a system that gave workers no choice but to accept whatever conditions and wages were offered because the alternative was starvation, and this captive labor force, continuously replenished by waves of immigration from Europe, from people fleeing poverty and oppression in their home countries only to find different forms of poverty and oppression in Chicago's meatpacking plants, was essential to the entire operation because if workers had real alternatives, if they could refuse dangerous conditions or demand better wages without facing destitution, then the profit margins that made men like Armour wealthy would disappear. And so the system required keeping workers desperate, required maintaining a surplus labor pool that would accept any job at any wage, required crushing unions and labor organizing that might give workers collective power, required using police and private security and sometimes mob violence to ensure worker compliance, and required elaborate ideologies about the free market and individual responsibility that blamed workers for their own poverty while celebrating owners like Armour as self-made men whose wealth proved their superiority, when in fact the wealth proved nothing except that the system was designed to concentrate rewards at the top while distributing suffering throughout the rest, and that those at the top had the political and economic power to maintain this arrangement regardless of its human cost. Philip Danforth Armour was born in 1832 in Stockbridge, New York, to a farming family of modest means, the youngest of 6 children, and his early life gave little indication that he would become one of America's richest and most powerful industrialists, but from his youth he demonstrated certain qualities that would serve him well in the ruthless world of 19th-century capitalism: boundless energy, willingness to work long hours, ability to focus single-mindedly on goals, comfort with risk, and perhaps most importantly a capacity to make decisions based purely on economic calculation without allowing moral concerns to interfere, and this last quality, this ability to separate ethics from business, to treat economic activity as a domain governed by its own rules independent of broader moral principles, was perhaps the essential prerequisite for accumulating extreme wealth in this period, because if you allowed yourself to think too carefully about the suffering your business caused, about the workers injured in your plants or the families impoverished by your wage cuts or the animals killed in conditions of terror and pain, you would hesitate, you would make different decisions, you would sacrifice profit for principle, and in the competitive environment of industrial capitalism such hesitation meant failure, meant being outcompete by those who had no such scruples, meant watching others accumulate the wealth that could have been yours if only you'd been willing to be more ruthless, and so the system selected for ruthlessness, rewarded those who could suppress empathy and moral concern in favor of pure profit maximization, and punished those who couldn't or wouldn't make this psychological adjustment, and Armour was among those who could, who possessed or developed the capacity to see workers and animals as nothing more than inputs in a production process, to view their suffering as economically irrelevant, to make decisions that he must have known caused enormous harm without apparently losing sleep over those decisions or questioning whether accumulating vast personal wealth justified the methods he employed, and this psychological profile, this combination of immense energy and ability with moral flexibility or blindness, characterized many of the great industrialists of the Gilded Age, men who were neither stupid nor personally cruel but who had convinced themselves that business operated according to different rules than personal life, that what would be morally abhorrent if done to individuals you knew personally was somehow acceptable when done at industrial scale to anonymous workers, and who maintained elaborate psychological defenses, religious conviction that their success proved God's favor, belief that they were actually benefiting workers by providing employment, conviction that they were serving society by making goods more affordable, certainty that their philanthropy redeemed any questionable business practices, that allowed them to live with themselves despite the harm they caused, and these defenses were probably necessary for their psychological survival because the alternative would have been acknowledging that they had built their fortunes on other people's suffering, that their mansions and art collections and philanthropic gestures were purchased with blood money, that they were not self-made men but exploiters who had succeeded by gaming a system rigged in their favor, and such acknowledgement would have been unbearable, would have required either giving up their wealth or living in conscious guilt, and since they were unwilling to do either they instead constructed elaborate narratives that justified their position and allowed them to see themselves as deserving, as superior, as actually the beneficiaries of workers and society rather than parasites upon them. Armour received limited formal education, leaving school at age 14 to work, and in 1852 at age 20 he joined the California Gold Rush, though characteristically he went not to mine gold but to recognize that miners needed supplies and that providing those necessities at inflated prices was more reliably profitable than gambling on finding gold himself, and he made his first substantial money running a sluice building in supply business, and this early experience taught him lessons he would apply throughout his career, that the real money was in controlling bottlenecks and necessities, in positioning yourself between people and things they needed and extracting tribute for access, in having monopoly or near monopoly control over something essential so that people had no choice but to pay your prices, and in working longer and harder than competitors but also more importantly in working smarter, in seeing opportunities others missed and in being willing to use methods others might find distasteful if those methods were profitable. And when he returned from California in 1856 with about $8,000 in capital, a substantial sum at the time, he had both money and business education and a clear understanding that fortunes were made not through labor, no matter how hard, but through ownership and control, through making your money work rather than working for money, through building systems that generated profit from other people's labor while you captured the surplus value. They created, and this understanding, this recognition that capitalism rewarded owners rather than workers regardless of who actually created value, was perhaps his most important insight, the one that allowed him to systematically pursue wealth rather than merely working hard and hoping for advancement. Armour moved to Cincinnati and then Milwaukee, working first in the grain and provision business in partnership with John Plankinton, learning the mechanisms of commodity trading and beginning to understand the potential of the growing meatpacking industry, which was being transformed by several technological and economic developments. Railroads that could bring livestock from western ranges to central processing locations and then ship meat to eastern markets, refrigeration technology that was beginning to allow fresh meat to be transported long distances without spoiling, growing urban populations in the east that needed reliable sources of affordable meat, and consolidation in the industry as the most efficient and best capitalized operators began driving out smaller competitors, and Armour recognized that this was an industry poised for explosive growth, that whoever could establish dominant market position and achieve economies of scale would make enormous profits, and that the key was vertical integration, controlling every step from purchasing live animals to selling processed meat, eliminating middlemen and capturing profit at every stage, and he began building the business model that would make his fortune, acquiring stockyards where animals were held before slaughter, building modern packing plants with mechanized disassembly lines that could process animals with unprecedented speed and efficiency, investing in refrigeration technology and refrigerated railroad cars that allowed him to ship fresh meat rather than having to salt or preserve it, establishing distribution networks and relationships with retailers in eastern cities, and slowly, systematically, ruthlessly eliminating or absorbing competitors until he controlled an increasing share of the market, and the key to all of this, the mechanism that made it profitable, was cost minimization at every point, paying as little as possible for livestock, processing them with maximum efficiency using the cheapest possible labor, utilizing every part of every animal to avoid waste, transporting at lowest cost, and always pushing to reduce expenses and increase volume because profit came from the margin multiplied by scale, and at the volumes Armour was achieving even tiny margins per unit added up to enormous profits. In 1867, Armour moved his operations to Chicago, which was rapidly becoming the center of American meatpacking because of its central location, its extensive railroad connections, and the massive Union stockyards that opened in 1865, consolidating what had previously been scattered stockyard operations across the city into a single 475-acre complex that would become the industrial heart of Chicago's meatpacking empire, and the stockyards were themselves a marvel of industrial organization and a monument to brutality, a vast complex of pens where hundreds of thousands of animals, cattle, pigs, sheep, were held awaiting slaughter, where the sounds and smells of animal fear and excrement filled the air, where workers drove animals through chutes toward the killing floors, where the entire operation was organized with mechanical efficiency to move animals from pen to slaughter to processing as quickly as possible, minimizing the time and cost of holding live animals while maximizing throughput, and surrounding the stockyards were the packing plants, massive industrial buildings where the actual killing and processing happened, where animals entered alive and left as packaged meat, where the disassembly lines that would later inspire Henry Ford's automobile assembly lines operated in reverse, with workers stationed along the line each performing a specialized task, stunning, throat-cutting, skinning, eviscerating, butchering, packing, as animal carcasses moved past on hooks and conveyor systems, and the speed of these lines was punishing, with workers expected to perform their tasks on animal after animal with minimal pause, hour after hour, day after day, in conditions that were cold and wet and bloody, where the floors were slippery with blood and fat and offal, where the air was thick with the smell of death and the steam from rendering vats, where machinery operated constantly with minimal safety guards, where a moment of inattention or exhaustion could result in serious injury, and where the cumulative physical toll of the work, the repetitive motions, the heavy lifting, the exposure to cold and chemicals, the psychological impact of constant killing, meant that workers' bodies broke down quickly, that men in their 30s had the bodies of men in their 50s, that injuries were common and often resulted in permanent disability, and that the workers who did this terrible work were treated as disposable, easily replaced by the constant stream of new immigrants arriving in Chicago looking for any employment they could find. Armour and Company, which Philip Armour founded in Chicago and built into one of the largest meatpacking operations in the world, operated on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. By the 1890s the company was slaughtering millions of animals annually, operating multiple packing plants in Chicago and other cities, employing thousands of workers, shipping meat across the country and internationally, generating revenues in the tens of millions of dollars, and producing not just fresh and preserved meat but an astonishing array of byproducts, because one of Armour's innovations was the recognition that complete utilization of every animal part, no matter how seemingly valueless, could add significantly to profits, and so the company developed processes for turning every piece of every animal into something that could be sold. Hides became leather, bones became fertilizer or were ground for various uses, blood was processed into multiple products, hooves became glue, hair was used in various applications, internal organs became sausage casings or were processed for other uses, glands were extracted for pharmaceutical purposes, and on, with the famous Armour boast that they used everything but the squeal, and while this total utilization was efficient from a business perspective and reduced waste, it also revealed the fundamentally instrumental view of animals that characterized industrial meatpacking, the reduction of living sentient beings to nothing more than raw materials to be completely extracted and monetized, with no recognition of or concern for the fact that these had been creatures capable of feeling pain and fear, that the terror they experienced in the stockyards and on the killing floors was real and intense, that the methods used to kill them often caused unnecessary suffering because speed and cost efficiency were prioritized over humane treatment, and that the sheer scale of the killing, thousands of animals daily at each major plant, millions annually across the industry, represented something historically unprecedented, an industrial system for death that treated killing as just another manufacturing process to be optimized for maximum efficiency and minimum cost, and this system, which Armour helped pioneer and perfect, established patterns that persist in modified form in contemporary industrial meat production, where animals are still raised in intensive confinement operations and killed on high-speed disassembly lines where profit margins remain thin and competitive pressure drives constant efforts to reduce costs, and where workers still face dangerous conditions and low wages and where the same basic tension exists between humane treatment and economic efficiency, with efficiency almost always winning because the market rewards low prices and punishes companies that spend more than necessary on animal welfare or worker safety or environmental protection. The workers who made Philip Armour's fortune possible, who did the actual killing and cutting and packing that transformed live animals into marketable meat, were overwhelmingly immigrants, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe, Poles, Lithuanians, Slovaks, Bohemians, Italians, people who had fled poverty and oppression in their home countries, who often spoke little or no English, who had few skills that were valuable in industrial America, and who therefore had no choice but to take whatever work they could find at whatever wages were offered, and the meatpacking companies exploited this vulnerability systematically, paying minimal wages, offering no job security, providing no safety equipment or training, taking no responsibility for injuries or deaths that occurred at work, using ethnic divisions to prevent worker solidarity by pitting different immigrant groups against each other, employing speed-up techniques that required workers to process more animals per hour, cutting wages whenever market conditions allowed, firing workers who complained or tried to organize unions, maintaining blacklists of troublemakers, who would never be hired anywhere in the industry, and creating a work environment characterized by fear and desperation and the constant knowledge that you were completely expendable, that if you were injured or killed your family would receive nothing, that if you missed work because of illness you would likely be fired, that your wages were barely sufficient to keep your family alive even when you were working full-time, and that there was no path to advancement, no hope that hard work would lead to better positions or higher pay, just the grinding reality that you would do this terrible work for as long as your body held out and then you would be discarded and replaced by the next desperate immigrant. And this was not an accident or an unfortunate side effect of industrialization but was the deliberate business model, the mechanism through which profit was generated, because every dollar saved on wages or safety equipment or working conditions was a dollar added to Philip Armour's fortune, and the system worked precisely because workers had no alternatives and no power, because the legal system protected property rights and contract rights but provided minimal protection for workers, because police and private security forces were available to crush strikes and intimidate organizers, because the ideology of the Period blamed poverty on individual moral failings rather than systemic exploitation, and because the wealthy had enough political influence to ensure that the system remained rigged in their favor, with minimal regulation, minimal taxation, minimal worker protections, and maximum freedom for capital to pursue profit by whatever means were most efficient. The living conditions of meatpacking workers in the neighborhood surrounding the stockyards, areas like Packingtown, back of the yards, and Bridgeport, were as brutal as their working conditions. Families crowded into small tenement apartments or cheaply built wooden houses, often sharing space with other families to split rent, with minimal sanitation, no indoor plumbing in many cases, inadequate heating in winter, poor ventilation in summer, and the ever-present smell of the stockyards that permeated everything, that got into clothes and furniture and food, that you could never escape because the wind carried it constantly, and disease spread rapidly in these conditions, with tuberculosis and typhoid and dysentery endemic, with infant mortality rates horrifyingly high, with the life expectancy of packing house workers significantly lower than the city average, and children growing up in these neighborhoods faced limited opportunities, with many forced to leave school early to work and contribute to family survival, with few resources for education or advancement, with gang activity and crime often seeming like the only paths to prosperity, and with the constant example before them of their parents' broken bodies and exhausted spirits as evidence of what wage labor in industrial capitalism offered the working class, and yet despite these conditions, or perhaps because of them, these neighborhoods also became sites of resistance and organization, where workers began forming unions and mutual aid societies, where immigrant communities maintained cultural traditions and supported each other, where political radicalism found fertile ground as workers realized that individual effort within the existing system would never lead to better lives and that collective action to change the system itself was necessary, and where the seeds were planted for the labor movements that would eventually win some improvements in working conditions and wages, though never without fierce opposition from the meatpacking companies who fought every attempt at organization with all available means including violence, and never achieving full justice or equality because the fundamental power imbalance between capital and labor remained, but at least creating some constraints on the most extreme forms of exploitation and establishing the principle that workers had rights that deserved legal protection even if those rights were honored more in breach than observance. With his fortune secure by the 1880s, with Armour and Company established as one of the dominant firms in the industry, with his personal wealth estimated at tens of millions of dollars making him one of the richest men in America, Philip Armour turned his attention to the question that wealthy men inevitably face: how to convert economic power into social legitimacy, how to make new money respectable, how to ensure that his family would be accepted among America's elite rather than viewed as upstarts whose wealth smelled of the stockyards, and the answer, as it had been for other industrial barons, was conspicuous display through architecture and lifestyle, through building a mansion that announced arrival, through entertaining lavishly, through philanthropic gestures, through marriage alliances for his children, and through all the performances that wealth required in order to transmute mere money into actual status. And so in the mid-1880s Armour purchased property on Prairie Avenue, then Chicago's most fashionable residential street, where other industrial magnates including Marshall Field, George Pullman, and fellow meatpacker Gustavus Swift had built impressive homes, creating a concentrated enclave of wealth that was simultaneously a neighborhood where peers could socialize and support each other and a defensive clustering where the rich could maintain distance from and surveillance over the working classes who might otherwise threaten them, because Prairie Avenue's location on the south side placed it near the industrial areas where the wealthy made their money but in a carefully maintained residential district that excluded the poor and the industrial activities themselves, creating a spatial arrangement that allowed the rich to benefit from proximity to their businesses while insulating themselves from the noise and smell and sight of industrial production and from contact with the workers whose labor generated their wealth, and this pattern of spatial segregation, of the rich living near but separate from industrial areas, with working-class neighborhoods forming around factories and stockyards while wealthy neighborhoods maintained distance and exclusivity, was being established across American industrial cities in this period, creating the geographic inequality that still characterizes most American urban areas, where wealth and poverty exist in close proximity but rarely interact, where the rich and poor live in different worlds. Despite occupying the same city, and where physical distance makes it easier to maintain psychological distance, to avoid confronting the human consequences of economic systems, to live in comfortable denial about where wealth comes from and what it costs. The mansion that Philip Armour commissioned for his Prairie Avenue property was extraordinary in its defensive character, and contemporary descriptions and photographs reveal a structure that looked less like a home than like a fortress, with massive stone walls constructed from rough-cut limestone that gave the building a fortified appearance, with relatively small windows that seemed almost like embrasures from which defenders might shoot, with towers and turrets that evoked medieval castles. With heavy iron gates and fencing, with an overall design that prioritized security and intimidation over welcoming beauty, and while the architectural style is generally classified as Romanesque Revival, which was popular in this period for substantial buildings and which drew inspiration from medieval European architecture with its rounded arches and heavy masonry and fortress-like qualities, the specific execution of Armour's mansion took these defensive qualities to an extreme that reveals his state of mind and his perception of his relationship to the city around him, because why does a man build his home to look like he's expecting siege unless he fears attack, unless he knows that he's hated, unless he understands that the wealth he's accumulated has made him enemies, that the workers in his plants curse his name, that labor organizers and socialists and anarchists view men like him as legitimate targets, and that the social peace is fragile enough that preparation for violence is prudent, and this defensiveness was not paranoid delusion but realistic assessment because the 1880s and 1890s in Chicago were characterized by intense class conflict, with strikes and protests regular occurrences, with the Haymarket Affair of 1886 when a bomb killed police officers during a labor protest leading to hysteria about anarchist violence and the controversial execution of labor organizers, with the Pullman strike of 1894 bringing federal troops to Chicago to break the strike and resulting in deaths of workers, with constant smaller-scale conflicts between labor and capital that sometimes turned violent, and with rhetoric on both sides that suggested irreconcilable conflict, with labor radicals arguing that the wealthy were parasites who should be expropriated and sometimes that violence against them was justified, and with the wealthy responding with their own violence through police and private security and with propaganda campaigns portraying workers as dangerous foreigners who threatened American civilization, and in this context building your home as a fortress made perfect sense, represented a reasonable response to genuine threat, and the fact that it was necessary, that men like Armour felt they needed fortified homes with armed guards, tells us something crucial about the society they had created, about the levels of inequality and exploitation that had made such extreme defensiveness rational, about how a society that produces great wealth for a few while keeping most in poverty and insecurity inevitably produces class hatred and conflict and requires the wealthy to live in fear behind walls and gates and guards, and how this is not a stable or desirable social arrangement but rather one characterized by constant tension and low-level violence and the ever-present possibility of explosion into larger conflict. The interior of Armour's mansion, in contrast to the forbidding exterior, was decorated with all the expected markers of Gilded Age wealth and taste, or at least wealth and what passed for taste among the newly rich, imported marble from Italy for floors and fireplaces, carved wood paneling throughout the principal rooms, crystal chandeliers imported from Europe, silk wall coverings and elaborate plasterwork on ceilings, heavy draperies and expensive carpets, period furniture that attempted to evoke European aristocratic traditions, paintings and sculpture that were more about demonstrating wealth than reflecting genuine connoisseurship, and all the accumulated objects and decorations that announced that the inhabitant had money and wanted you to know it, and the overall effect was probably what we might call nouveau riche, marked by obvious expense and quantity but lacking the assured restraint that old money developed over generations, still trying too hard, still announcing itself too loudly, still revealing through overabundance and occasional lapses in taste that this was purchased legitimacy rather than inherited culture, that Philip Armour knew more about meatpacking than about art history, that his fortune was too recent and too obviously made through methods that polite society preferred not to examine too closely, and that no amount of marble or silk could fully cleanse money that smelled of blood and smoke from the stockyards, and this tension between Armour's immense wealth and his incomplete social acceptance, between his economic power and his cultural legitimacy, characterized much of the Gilded Age, when industrial fortunes were being made with unprecedented speed and the men who made them were trying to force their way into a social elite that had traditionally been reserved for older merchant families or landed gentry, and the result was often awkward, marked by conspicuous consumption that revealed more about anxiety than confidence, by displays that were too elaborate and too obvious, by social climbing that was transparent and sometimes pathetic, and by a fundamental insecurity that all the money in the world couldn't quite eliminate, because Armour and men like him knew that others looked down on them, knew that their wealth was new and their methods were questionable and their cultural education was limited, and no number of European paintings or marble floors could completely erase that knowledge or the resentment it generated. Philip Armour lived in his fortress mansion with his wife Malvina Bell Ogden, whom he had married in 1863, and their children, including sons Jonathan Ogden Armour and Philip Danforth Armour Jr., and daughter Lolita, and the family maintained a household that at its peak employed over 20 servants including a butler, footmen, ladies' maids, chambermaids, cooks, kitchen assistants, laundresses, coachmen, grooms, and groundskeepers, all of whom were necessary to maintain the lifestyle that the house and the family's social position demanded, because at this level of wealth you didn't cook your own meals or clean your own rooms or drive your own carriage or tend your own grounds, you had people for all of that, and these people, these servants whose names have been mostly lost to history, who appear in the record primarily as line items in household budgets or occasionally as names in census records without individual stories or personalities, were essential to the entire performance of upper-class life, because the Armour family's ability to live in leisure, to entertain lavishly, to present themselves as cultured and refined, depended completely on this army of workers performing all the actual labor required to maintain the house and serve the family, and the invisibility of this labor was essential to the performance, because acknowledging the machinery would undermine the illusion that the family's life was naturally elegant and effortless, would reveal that every comfortable moment required someone else's hard work, would make it impossible to maintain the pretense that the family's superior position reflected their inherent superiority rather than their ability to purchase other people's labor, and so the servants were trained to be invisible, to appear only when needed and disappear when their tasks were complete, to anticipate needs without being asked, to maintain absolute deference and never intrude their own personalities or needs into the family's consciousness, to live on the property in servant quarters that were far less comfortable than the family spaces, to work long hours, often from before the family woke until after they retired, for modest wages, to have minimal personal freedom or privacy, to accept that their lives were structured entirely around serving the family's needs, and to perform constant emotional labor, maintaining cheerful obedience regardless of how they were treated or what they actually felt, and the power dynamics of this relationship, where workers were completely dependent on the family for both employment and housing, and where dismissal could mean not just lost income but immediate homelessness, were fundamentally coercive, created conditions where servants had limited ability to refuse demands or set boundaries or insist on their own rights, and while Philip Armour may have considered himself a good employer, while he may have paid standard wages and not been unusually cruel by the standards of his class and time, the relationship was still one of profound inequality and exploitation, still required these workers to subordinate their entire lives to his family's comfort, and still rested on the same basic logic that governed his meatpacking plants, extracting maximum value from workers for minimum cost, treating human labor as just another commodity to be purchased as cheaply as possible, and maintaining hierarchies of power that ensured compliance. The Armour family entertained at their mansion in the style expected of their class, hosting dinners and receptions and balls where Chicago's industrial elite gathered to eat elaborate meals prepared by their cooks and served by their servants, to drink imported wine and liquor, to discuss business and politics and social matters, to make deals and arrangements that would shape the city's economic development, to intermarry their children and consolidate their positions, and to perform for each other the rituals of wealth and culture that distinguished them from the working classes they employed. And these social events were simultaneously genuine social occasions where people enjoyed themselves and strategic opportunities where alliances were formed and maintained, where business information was exchanged, where political influence was coordinated, where the wealthy acted as a class to protect and advance their collective interests, and where they reinforced for each other the narratives that justified their position, that they deserved their wealth because of their superior ability and character, that they were benefiting society by providing employment and producing goods, that the poor were poor because of their own moral failings rather than systemic exploitation, that any attempt to regulate business or empower workers threatened prosperity and freedom, and that their position at the top of the social hierarchy was natural and proper and should be defended against any challenge. And this constant mutual reinforcement, this echo chamber where the wealthy told each other that they deserved everything they had and owed nothing to anyone, was essential to maintaining both their political power and their psychological equilibrium, because without it they might have been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how their fortunes were actually made, about whether their success really reflected their merit, about what obligations they might have to those whose labor generated their wealth, and about whether a system that produced such extreme inequality while claiming to be democratic could be morally legitimate. Philip Armour's relationship to philanthropy was typical of Gilded Age industrialists in being simultaneously genuine and self-serving, motivated by religious conviction and by desire for reputation, reflecting real concern for social problems and transparent attempt at reputation laundering, and resulting in institutions that did genuine good while never addressing the systemic problems that made such charity necessary. Because Armour donated substantial sums to various causes including founding the Armour Mission in Chicago's poor neighborhoods and establishing the Armour Institute of Technology, which later became the Illinois Institute of Technology, and these institutions provided real services and opportunities, offered education and training that some individuals used to improve their lives, and represented a sincere belief on Armour's part that he had obligations to use his wealth for public benefit, but they also functioned as reputation management, as ways to be known for something other than the brutal conditions in his meatpacking plants, as evidence he could point to when critics accused him of exploitation, and as substitutes for actually paying his workers better wages or improving their working conditions or allowing them to unionize. Because the logic of philanthropic capitalism has always been that the wealthy should be free to accumulate fortunes through whatever means are most efficient and then should voluntarily use some portion of those fortunes for public good, rather than the alternative model where workers are paid fair wages in the first place and where taxation redistributes wealth democratically and where communities have control over their own development, and Armour's philanthropy, like that of Carnegie and Rockefeller and other Gilded Age titans, was premised on the idea that concentrated wealth in the hands of superior men would be deployed more wisely than if that wealth were distributed among workers or collected through taxes, that Armour knew better than anyone else how money should be spent for social benefit, and that his judgment about what institutions should be founded and what causes should be supported should prevail over democratic decision-making, and this model of philanthropic capitalism, which persists today in the form of billionaire foundations and charitable giving, is fundamentally anti-democratic because it allows private individuals to make decisions about social priorities based on their personal preferences rather than through collective democratic processes, and it creates situations where a billionaire's whim can direct more resources to a particular cause than entire communities can muster, where Armour could found an institute because he personally thought technical education was important while the workers in his plants lacked basic healthcare and lived in wretched conditions, and where the narrative focuses on the generosity of the gift rather than on the exploitation that made the gift possible, on Armour as benefactor rather than on the workers whose underpaid labor generated the surplus he was giving away, and this asymmetry, this focus on the donor rather than on those who actually created the wealth, is itself ideological, shapes how we think about wealth and poverty and obligation and justice in ways that systematically favor the interests of the wealthy. The golden age of Philip Armour's mansion and of Prairie Avenue generally was brief, lasting only a couple of decades before the neighborhood's character began changing in ways that made it less desirable for the wealthy, because Chicago's rapid industrial growth and the expansion of railroad yards and the stockyards themselves gradually encroached on what had been an exclusive residential area, bringing smoke and noise and the constant smell of industry, and as the area became less pleasant, the wealthy began moving elsewhere, north along the lakefront to neighborhoods like the Gold Coast, or to suburbs like Lake Forest and Evanston where they could maintain greater distance from the industrial activities that generated their wealth, and this pattern of movement, this constant attempt by the wealthy to escape the environmental consequences of the industries that made them rich, was playing out in industrial cities across America, with the poor living near factories and industrial areas and suffering the pollution and noise and health impacts while the rich kept moving farther away seeking clean air and quiet and natural beauty. And this spatial segregation had important consequences because it allowed the wealthy to avoid confronting the costs of industrial production, to live in bubbles where the smoke-filled skies and polluted rivers and destroyed landscapes that characterized industrial areas seemed like distant problems rather than immediate realities, to raise their children in environments so different from the workers' neighborhoods that cross-class empathy became nearly impossible, and to construct entire worldviews and political positions based on their own comfortable experiences while remaining ignorant of or indifferent to the experiences of the working classes who lived in completely different conditions. Philip Armour died in January 1901 at age 68, relatively young by the standards of his class, though not surprising given the stress of managing a vast industrial empire and the rich diet and lifestyle that characterized wealthy men of this era, and he left a fortune estimated at $50 million, perhaps $1.5 billion in today's money, primarily to his wife and sons, along with expectations that they would continue the business and maintain the family's position, but the next generation never had quite the same drive or ruthlessness that Philip had demonstrated, and while Armour and Company continued to operate and even grow for decades after his death, eventually becoming one of the big four meatpackers that dominated the industry until antitrust actions in the 1920s forced some restructuring, the family's direct involvement gradually declined and the company became more professionalized and less personal, and this transition from family capitalism to corporate capitalism, from businesses run by their owners to businesses run by professional managers answerable to boards and shareholders, was occurring across American industry in the early 20th century and had complex implications, because on one hand it potentially introduced some constraints on the most extreme forms of personal exploitation, made companies subject to more public scrutiny and legal liability, and created some space for reform as progressive-era regulations began requiring basic safety standards and limiting the most egregious abuses, but on the other hand it diffused responsibility to the point where no individual could be held accountable for corporate decisions, made it easier for those making decisions to distance themselves from the human consequences because they were just managing someone else's property rather than exercising personal power, and arguably made the system more efficient at exploitation because corporate structures could optimize for profit in ways that individual owners constrained by personal relationships and local knowledge might not. And the meatpacking industry in the 20th century continued to be characterized by low wages and dangerous working conditions and high worker turnover, continued to resist unionization until forced to accept it, continued to prioritize cost-cutting and speed over safety and quality, and continued to generate enormous profits for owners and shareholders while the workers who did the actual dangerous work of killing and processing animals remained poor and vulnerable and exploited, suggesting that the problem was never primarily about particular bad individuals like Philip Armour but about structural features of industrial capitalism that create incentives for exploitation and make treating workers and animals as mere commodities economically rational regardless of who owns or manages the companies. The fortress mansion that Philip Armour built, meant to establish his family's permanent place among Chicago's elite, to provide a home for generations, and to stand as a monument to his success, outlived him but not by as long as he probably imagined when he built it, because the decline of Prairie Avenue continued after his death, with more wealthy families moving away, with the grand homes being subdivided or converted to other uses or left vacant, and with the area gradually transitioning from exclusive residential district to mixed commercial and residential area and eventually to partial abandonment and demolition. And the Armour mansion specifically was maintained by the family for some years but became increasingly impractical as a residence, too large to staff and maintain, too close to industrial areas, too associated with a past that the family may have wanted to leave behind, and eventually most of the structure was demolished, with only fragments possibly remaining incorporated into later buildings, and this destruction was typical of what happened to many Gilded Age mansions, particularly those in cities where land values and development pressures made maintaining huge old houses economically irrational, and where changing social values and the decline of domestic service and the introduction of income and estate taxes that made maintaining dynastic wealth more difficult all combined to make these palaces seem like relics of an embarrassing past rather than treasures to be preserved, and so they were torn down, replaced with new development or left as vacant lots, and the dynasties they were meant to house and announce proved as impermanent as the buildings themselves, lasting maybe 2 or 3 generations before fragmenting or fading or being absorbed into the broader wealthy class without the specific identity and power that the founders had imagined would last forever. What remains of the Armour legacy today is contested and complex, because on one hand the company he founded continued to operate for decades and became one of the most recognizable brands in American food, with Armour hot dogs and other products remaining familiar even after the company went through various corporate transformations and was eventually broken up and sold to different buyers. And the Armour Institute he founded became Illinois Institute of Technology, a significant educational institution that has trained thousands of students, and his name remains part of Chicago history, appearing in street names and building names and historical accounts, and in this sense his ambition to create lasting legacy succeeded at least partially. His name is remembered even if the specific details of how he made his fortune have been softened or forgotten by most people. But on the other hand, what's primarily remembered about the meatpacking industry of his era, what gives it lasting historical significance, is not the industrialists who made fortunes but the exposé of conditions that Upton Sinclair's The Jungle provided in 1906, the images of workers laboring in brutal conditions and of adulterated meat products that shocked the public and led to the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. And while those reforms were limited and the industry fought them fiercely and found ways around many of the intended protections, the narrative that came to dominate was not about the genius of men like Armour who industrialized meat production but about the horrors they created in their pursuit of profit, about the suffering of workers and animals and the deception of consumers, about the need for government regulation to constrain corporate behavior, and about the dark underside of industrial capitalism that Gilded Age wealth was built upon, and this counter-narrative, this insistence on centering the workers and the costs rather than celebrating the industrialists and their mansions, represents a kind of historical justice even if it came too late to help those who suffered under Armour's system and even if it hasn't prevented similar exploitation in contemporary food systems. The workers who made Philip Armour rich, whose names we mostly don't know, who appear in historical records as statistics or occasional newspaper mentions but rarely as individuals with their own stories, were the real story of the meatpacking industry, and any honest accounting requires centering their experience rather than treating them as background to Armour's biography, because they were the ones who stood on killing floors and cut throats and dismembered carcasses and packed meat and cleaned the blood and endured the cold and the heat and the exhaustion and the injuries and the disease and the poverty. They were the ones whose labor actually created the wealth that built the fortress mansion, whose bodies were broken so that Armour could live in luxury, who worked until they couldn't work anymore and then were discarded and replaced by the next wave of desperate immigrants, and their experience of constant insecurity and exploitation and suffering was the direct corollary to Armour's experience of security and power and comfort, because the system was designed to transfer value from their labor to his pocket, to take what they produced and give them back only a fraction while he captured the rest, and this wasn't some unfortunate side effect but was the fundamental mechanism, was how industrial capitalism worked and continues to work, and understanding this, really grasping it, means recognizing that Philip Armour's mansion wasn't built with his own labor or genius or special merit but was built with the stolen labor of thousands of workers who never received the full value of what they produced, who were systematically exploited through a combination of economic necessity that gave them no choice but to accept whatever conditions were offered and political power that prevented them from organizing to demand better. And that the mansion's fortress-like character revealed that Armour understood this at some level, understood that his wealth was extracted from others, that those others had good reason to resent him, and that he needed walls and guards to protect himself from potential resistance or revenge, and that this need for defensive architecture was itself an admission of guilt, an acknowledgement that the wealth was ill-gotten even if he would never have used those words, that the system was unjust even if he benefited from it and defended it, and that no amount of philanthropy or cultural patronage or religious observance could fully cleanse money that had blood and suffering in its origins. The question of what to make of stories like Philip Armour's, how to remember and understand Gilded Age industrialists and their mansions, is ultimately a question about how we understand American capitalism and wealth inequality and the relationship between past and present, because we can tell these stories in ways that center the industrialists and present them as complex figures who did both good and harm, who built important institutions and created jobs even while exploiting workers, who were products of their time and shouldn't be judged by contemporary standards, and whose legacies are mixed. Or we can tell these stories in ways that center the workers and insist that the exploitation was the essential thing, that whatever goods came from the system were massively outweighed by the suffering it caused, that the industrialists were primarily exploiters regardless of their philanthropic gestures, and that their fortunes and mansions and legacies were all built on theft and should be remembered primarily as evidence of injustice, and these different narrative frames shape not just how we think about history but how we think about contemporary wealth and inequality, because if we adopt the first frame then today's billionaires are like the Gilded Age industrialists, complex figures doing both good and harm whose wealth reflects some mix of merit and systemic advantage and whose philanthropy deserves credit even if their business practices deserve criticism. But if we adopt the second frame then today's billionaires are also primarily exploiters accumulating wealth through systems that extract value from workers and communities and the environment, whose philanthropy is reputation laundering that doesn't address the fundamental injustice of their accumulation, and whose wealth represents not merit but power and should be subject to redistribution through democratic means. And the stakes of these interpretive choices are high because they influence public policy debates about taxation and regulation and labor law and all the mechanisms through which we collectively decide how market economies should be structured and constrained, and so telling the story of Philip Armour and his fortress mansion is never just about historical interest but is always also about contemporary politics, about whether we're going to accept extreme inequality as natural or challenge it as unjust, about whose interests our economic system should serve, and about what kind of society we want to create. The fortress that Philip Armour built, with its thick walls and defensive design, stands as a metaphor for the relationship between wealth and democracy and industrial capitalism, because when the wealthy feel they need fortresses to protect themselves from the workers and communities they exploit, when they cluster together in exclusive enclaves and hire private security and use political influence to ensure that police and military forces will protect property against popular demands for redistribution, when they live in constant fear despite having everything material comfort could provide, this reveals that they understand at some level that the system is unjust, that their position is illegitimate, that their wealth is stolen, and that maintaining it requires force rather than consent, requires coercion rather than agreement, requires walls and guards and violence rather than social acceptance. And a society characterized by such extreme defensive arrangements is not a healthy or stable or desirable society but is one in constant low-level conflict, where the wealthy and the poor live in different worlds and see each other as threats rather than as fellow citizens, where democracy becomes merely formal because the wealthy have so much more power to shape policy and control outcomes that popular sovereignty means little in practice, and where the potential for breakdown or explosion into larger conflict is always present because systems based on exploitation and coercion are inherently unstable and can't be permanently maintained, and the fact that we're seeing similar patterns today, with the wealthy living in gated communities and hiring private security and buying political influence and trying to insulate themselves from the consequences of the inequality they benefit from, suggests that we haven't learned the lessons that the Gilded Age should have taught us, that we're repeating the same patterns and heading toward the same kinds of conflict, and that the choice facing us is whether we're going to reform our systems to create more equality and genuine democracy or whether we're going to allow inequality to keep growing until the social contract breaks entirely and we face the kind of widespread conflict that the fortress builders feared and that their defensive architecture anticipated.